In the late summer of 479 BCE, on a dusty plain beneath the slopes of Mount Cithaeron in Boeotia, the largest army Greece had ever assembled stood facing the last great host of the Persian Empire. And though history would remember Thermopylae for its tragedy and Salamis for its brilliance, it was here, at Plataea, that the fate of Greek freedom was finally and permanently decided, because a decade earlier the Persian king Darius had sent an expedition to punish Athens for its support of a failed Ionian revolt, only to see his army crushed at Marathon in 490 BCE, a humiliation that festered in Persian memory until Darius's son Xerxes inherited both the throne and the grudge, and resolved to finish what his father had started, not with a raid this time, but with the full might of the empire. And so in 480 BCE Xerxes marched south with what ancient sources exaggerate into the millions, but modern historians place more soberly in the range of 100 to 200,000 men. Supported by a fleet of well over 1,000 ships drawn from every corner of the Persian world, from Egyptian marines to Phoenician sailors to Ionian Greeks serving under compulsion, and against this the fractious city-states of Greece, who spent as much energy quarreling with one another as they did preparing for war, somehow managed to form a defensive alliance, the Hellenic League, under the uneasy leadership of Sparta, the only Greek power whose army commanded universal respect. And the opening act of this war is the one everyone remembers, the 300 Spartans and their allies holding the narrow pass at Thermopylae for 3 days against overwhelming odds before being betrayed and annihilated to the last man, buying just enough time for the Greek fleet to prepare its response. And while Leonidas and his men were dying in the pass, the Athenians made the wrenching decision to abandon their own city, evacuating the population to the island of Salamis and watching from a distance as Xerxes marched into an empty Athens and burned the Acropolis in an act of retribution and spite. But it was at Salamis, in the narrow straits between the island and the mainland, that the Greek admiral Themistocles executed one of the most consequential tactical deceptions in military history, luring the massive but unwieldy Persian fleet into confined waters where its numbers became a liability rather than an asset, and the resulting naval battle shattered Persian sea power so thoroughly that Xerxes, fearing for his line of retreat and his own throne back home, withdrew to Asia with the bulk of his forces. But he left behind something almost as dangerous as his full invasion force, a hand-picked army of perhaps 40 to 60,000 elite troops under the command of his brother-in-law Mardonius, a capable and ambitious general who believed, not without reason, that Greece could still be conquered by land even after the setback at sea, and Mardonius spent the winter of 480 to 479 wintering in Thessaly. Then in the spring he tried diplomacy first, offering the Athenians remarkably generous terms, autonomy, alliance, even territorial expansion, if only they would abandon the Greek cause. And to their eternal credit the Athenians refused, choosing instead to evacuate their city a second time and throw their lot in fully with the alliance, a decision that infuriated Mardonius and led him to march south and burn what remained of Athens for a second time, reducing the city to ash and rubble as a message to the rest of Greece about the cost of continued resistance. And it worked as pressure but not as persuasion, because the Athenians turned to Sparta and essentially demanded that the Spartans stop hiding behind the defensive wall they were building across the Isthmus of Corinth and actually commit their army to a field battle before there was no Athens left to save. And this appeal put Sparta in an agonizing position, because Spartan society was built around a permanent, simmering fear of Helot revolt, the massive subjugated population of Messenian serfs whose labor sustained the entire Spartan way of life, and sending the army north meant leaving home dangerously exposed. But the Spartan leadership, under the regent Pausanias, who was serving as guardian and commander for the young king Pleistarchus, ultimately made the fateful decision to march, and remarkably they did it in secret, slipping the army out at night, so that even the Athenian ambassadors pressing them for help did not immediately know a decision had been made. And when the combined Greek army finally converged near Plataea in Boeotia, it constituted the single largest hoplite force ever fielded by the Greek world, something in the range of 40,000 heavy infantry alone, with Sparta contributing roughly 10,000 hoplites, including the famous 5,000 full Spartan citizens known as Spartiates, each attended by Helot auxiliaries, and Athens, contributing another 8,000 under the general Aristides, alongside contingents from Corinth, Megara, Tegea, and a long list of smaller allied cities, all told perhaps 100,000 men including light troops and support, arrayed against Mardonius and his Persian, Median, Bactrian, and Saka corps troops, reinforced by Greek collaborators from Thebes and Thessaly who had chosen to side with the invader, known to history as the Medizers, and for more than a week the two armies faced off across the Esopus River without committing to a full engagement, each commander wary of the other's strengths, because the Greek hoplite phalanx was virtually unbeatable in a direct infantry collision, while the Persian cavalry, particularly under the skilled commander Mecistius, was superior at harassment, skirmishing, and cutting supply lines, and it was this cavalry that drew first blood, riding hard against the Greek lines, and eventually being driven off in a clash that saw Mecistius himself killed, a genuine blow to Persian morale. But the standoff continued, with both sides maneuvering for advantageous ground, and both suffering as their water sources and supply lines came under threat, until the Persian cavalry successfully fouled the main spring supplying the Greek camp, and began raiding the mountain passes through which Greek supplies were arriving, forcing Pausanias to make the difficult decision to shift his entire army's position under cover of night, retreating toward a more defensible line closer to Plataea itself, where fresh water was available, and this night march, conducted by a coalition army speaking different dialects, following different commanders, and moving across unfamiliar terrain in darkness, predictably went wrong, with several contingents losing their way, falling behind, or simply refusing to move at all, and by dawn the Greek line was dangerously fragmented, the Spartans and Tegeans in one position, the Athenians diverted onto a different route entirely, and gaps opening across what should have been a unified front, and Mardonius, seeing what he believed was a Greek army in disorganized retreat, seized what looked like the decisive opportunity he had been waiting for, ordering a general advance across the Esopus to destroy the Spartan contingent before it could reform. And this is the moment the battle actually turns on, because the Spartans under Pausanias found themselves isolated and under direct assault from Persian infantry, protected by wicker shields and armed with bows and short spears, troops that were brave and disciplined, but simply outmatched in close-quarters combat by the heavier armor, longer spears, and rigid discipline of Spartan hoplites, and ancient accounts describe Pausanias delaying the order to advance despite the punishing rain of Persian arrows, waiting for favorable omens from the sacrifices, a detail that reveals just how deeply religious ritual was entangled with Greek military decision-making even in the empire's most desperate hour, until finally the omens turned favorable, or patience simply ran out, and the Spartan line surged forward into contact, and once Greek and Persian infantry met at close range the outcome was almost mathematically certain, because the Persian infantry's wicker shields could not stop a bronze-tipped Greek spear thrust, and man for man in a shoving, stabbing melee the hoplite was simply the superior instrument of war, and the fighting around Mardonius himself grew especially fierce as his bodyguard of 1,000 elite troops tried to hold the center, but when Mardonius was struck down and killed, reportedly by a Spartan named Eumnestus, the Persian line began to unravel, panic spreading outward from the command position as troops who had lost their leader and were already struggling against superior Greek arms began to break and flee toward their fortified camp, and simultaneously, on another part of the field, the Athenians had finally engaged the Theban and Boeotian Medizer forces, and in a bitterly ironic twist this portion of the battle, Greek against Greek, proved to be some of the hardest fighting of the day, precisely because both sides were using the same equipment, the same tactics, and the same relentless training, until the Thebans too broke and withdrew once word of the Persian collapse spread across the field, and what followed the initial rout was, by most ancient accounts, closer to a massacre than a battle, as the surviving Persian and allied troops fled to their wooden fortified camp near the river, a position that briefly held out against the pursuing Spartans until the Athenians, more experienced in siege tactics from their years of naval warfare, arrived to help storm the walls, at which point the camp was overrun and what remained of Mardonius's army was slaughtered almost to the last man, with ancient historians like Herodotus claiming the Persian dead numbered in the tens of thousands against remarkably light Greek casualties. Figures that modern historians treat with appropriate skepticism, given the ancient habit of exaggerating enemy losses. But even accounting for inflation, there is no doubt the defeat was catastrophic and total, effectively annihilating the last major Persian land force in Greece, and the political and cultural aftermath of Plataea was every bit as significant as the battle itself, because on the very same day, according to tradition, the Greek fleet won another decisive victory at Cape Mycalion, the coast of Asia Minor, destroying the remnants of Persian naval power and igniting a fresh wave of Ionian revolts against Persian rule, meaning that within a matter of hours Greece had simultaneously broken the Persian army and the Persian navy, ending for good any realistic prospect of a Persian conquest of the Greek mainland, and the city of Thebes, having backed the losing and traitorous side, was besieged shortly afterward and forced to hand over its pro-Persian leaders for execution. A harsh but clarifying lesson about the cost of collaboration, while Pausanias, the victorious Spartan commander, became for a brief moment the most celebrated man in Greece, credited with the discipline and generalship that held the line when it mattered most, though his later career would be marred by accusations of growing too fond of Persian luxury, and even secret negotiations with the enemy. A fall from grace that ended in his death, a reminder that Greek memory was often as unforgiving of its heroes as it was grateful for their victories, and in the broader sweep of history Plataea is frequently overshadowed in popular memory by the doomed heroism of Thermopylae or the tactical genius of Salamis, but it deserves to be remembered as the battle that actually ended the war. The moment when the largest and best army the Persian Empire could still field in Europe was destroyed outright on open ground, proving beyond any doubt that free Greek citizen soldiers, fighting for their homes, their families, and a political culture unlike anything else in the ancient world, could stand against and beat the might of the largest empire the earth had yet seen. And in the decades that followed, the confidence born of victories like Plataea fed directly into the golden age of Athens, the flowering of Athenian democracy, philosophy, and art under Pericles, the building of the Parthenon on the very Acropolis the Persians had burned, and an entire cultural flourishing that would go on to shape Western civilization for the next 2,500 years, all of it resting, in a very real sense, on the outcome of a few desperate hours of spear and shield combat on a dusty plain outside a small Boeotian town, whose name deserves to be spoken with the same reverence as Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis, because Plataea was not merely one battle among many in the Greco-Persian wars. It was the final answer to the question those wars had posed, whether Greece would remain free or become a distant province of an Eastern empire, and the answer, written in Persian blood on Boeotian soil in 479 BCE, was that Greece would remain free, and the world that followed, our world, was built on that answer.